There tends to be a number of misconceptions about what agriculture has done to us or for us, or didn't do to us or for us. And our readings tackle a number of really interesting questions regarding that. Was the change to agriculture a change to diets that are less nutritious? In terms of less macronutrients or less kilocalories or less protein or less micronutrients? And along with that, is there really a change in our health when we shifted from a hunter-gatherer subsistence system to an agricultural subsistence system? How has our health and our nutrition been impacted? Does an agricultural system reduce the amount of time that we spend in food acquisition? I mean, we just talked about the hunter-gatherer systems and the relatively small amount of time that it takes to acquire food for a fairly well-balanced diet. So is there a reduction of time in agriculture? Because that's supposed to be one of the benefits of agriculture, right? That you have everything that you need right there in front of you. And all you have to do is reap what you sow. You don't have to go out there and search for it. It's right there. It's controlled. It's guaranteed. Or is there actually an increase in the amount of time we spend in food production and in processing? What did agriculture actually bring us? Keep in mind that we are talking about a transformation when we're talking about agriculture. This has had significant impacts on our the structure of our societies and social organization. It increased our degree of sedentary lifestyle and the complexity of society as a result of living in larger communities that don't need to disperse. And that has completely changed the way that humans interact with their environment. We have a massive impact to the environment today, and that began with agriculture, because with agriculture you change the soil, you remove the native plants, you prevent those plants from growing back, and maybe you even exhaust the soils of nutrients so nothing can grow there for a while. In any case, we are talking about changing and completely modifying the environment, not living as a part of it like we would find in, or we tend to find in hunter-gatherer societies, but significantly modifying it. And before we jump into that, which our readings really explore anyway, I want to briefly look at where our crops come from and what those primary staples are. So where do our crops come from? And that's really an interesting question, because if I were to ask you where, I don't know, say pasta is from, or where fried rice is from, or where pemmican is from, you would probably have an answer. May not be exact, but you would have a regional response. Now, for some of you, you may also have a response if I were to ask you where avocados are from, or carrots, or coffee, or cattle, or turkey. But many of us might not know. Some of us do, because we tend to identify with certain dishes, right? And a dish can become culture. But we don't necessarily identify with the elements of food in a dish. There are 6 centers of crop origin in general. There's more than that, but this is all we're going to look at in this class. And these 6 I want you to know about, and we're going to explore aspects of them. They are the primary centers of domestication, or independent domestication, not exactly invention, But you can think of it like that, areas of origin. These are China and Eastern Asia at large, where you find rice and millet and soy and tea being among the more important crop domesticates that come from this region. Another one that we're not going to be talking about or looking at all in terms of nutrition, but that's very important in terms of economy, is silk, which comes from the silkworm. In Southeast Asia, you also have rice, but also fruit like mango, banana, coconut, grapefruit, sugarcane, bamboo, and the Near East, or the Fertile Crescent. It's probably one of the oldest centers of domestication. So the areas that we would call now Palestine, Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, Kuwait, Iraq. It's called the Fertile Crescent because some of the earliest and the first evidence that we have for domestication comes from this region, and because we thought of this area as being incredibly fertile, basically the birthplace of agriculture. Now, we know that's not 100% accurate. There, in fact, are many areas of origin or domestication. But you do get lots of different plants and animals being domesticated in the Fertile Crescent. These include barley, wheat, palm, flax, lentils, peas, canines, dogs, camels, pigs, sheep, etc. Next is Africa, especially sub-Saharan Africa, where you have domestication of yams and oil palm and coffee is from this region, originally domesticated here. Also, wheat and millet have very ancient histories of domestication here, even though they may have also been domesticated at around the same time in different parts of the world. And Mesoamerica, with so many domestic plants and animals that I'm not going to list them all, but some of the ones that you may have heard of, or the more important ones, would be maize, beans, avocados, squash, tomatoes, pumpkin, peppers, turkey, and for a cash crop, cotton. And last is South America, with staples like tubers, potatoes, and manioc come from here. And both are incredibly important. You also get gourds, peanuts, beans, peppers, pineapples, llamas, guinea pigs as well come from this region of the world. I don't have North America up here, but North America does have some domesticates, such as sunflowers, blueberries, artichokes, are a few that you've probably eaten or heard about before. Let's take a bit of time and explore a handful of the primary crop staples, which will benefit the readings this week. When we think of crops in terms of staples of diet, there are 6 primary staples, and 2 others that I'll briefly mention. When we look at state-level development, nearly all, even still today, are based off of one of these 6 or 8 crop staples. That's how important these foods are. And we'll start with millet. Millet may not be one of those cereal grains that you have heard a lot about, but it is incredibly important. It is the 6th most produced cereal crop in the world, with about 65 million metric tons produced in 2014, and that is a lot. Think of this, because I'm referring to million metric tons for each of these crops. 1 metric ton is equal to about 2,200 pounds. So 1 million metric tons is equal to about 2,200 million pounds. And we produced 65 million metric tons. That is a lot. and yet nowhere near as much compared to the other crops that we're going to be talking about. Millet is one of the most important crops that is grown for both human consumption and for livestock feed in countries around the world, especially places in Africa and Asia. Because it is productive and it has a fairly short growing season, you can grow this in high temperatures or in dry climates. Where was millet domesticated? Well, the origins are in China, with the earliest evidence dating back to about 8,500 years ago, but the evolutionary origins of millet are not in Asia. They are actually in Africa, where you get the greatest diversity of native millet. Nutritionally, about 100 grams of millet will give you 378 kilocalories. That's a lot, so it's fairly nutritious. By percentage, 100 grams is mostly carbohydrates. It's about 72% carbohydrates. There's a little bit of fat in that, about 4%, and a fair amount of protein, about 11%. Now, you don't need to know any of these values that I'm telling you. Just want to give them to you in case you are interested. And next is barley. This is the 5th most produced cereal crop in the world, with about 145 million tons produced in 2015, and nearly all of that going for human consumption. We use barley in so many of our foods. We use that in flour and grits and soups and stews, and even just eating the cooked plant itself in parts of Europe and parts of Africa and parts of the Middle East. We use barley in drinks, for example tea or alcoholic beverages, and we use it for livestock forage. And like with wheat and with millet, which we just talked about, barley contains gluten, which we'll look at aspects of this later in the term. Barley was one of the first grains domesticated, and the earliest evidence that we have for its domestication comes from the Fertile Crescent in the Near East. The archaeological evidence only dates to about 8,500 years ago, but genetic evidence for all of the domestic strains suggests that domestication probably happened at around 13,000 years ago. It is also a nutritionally rich food grain. So comparing this to the 100 gram again, 100 grams of barley equals about 352 kilocalories, which is a fair amount. Most of that, similar to millet, is carbohydrates. It's also fairly enriched in protein, similar to millet, about 10%, but a reduced fat content. And next are the potatoes, a starchy, tuberous plant. Now, you might not be surprised, but a lot of what we eat is toxic or poisonous. Or it can be if we eat that in high amounts, or if we eat a different part of the plant than we are used to eating. And the potato is a great example of that. We eat the tuber, but the leaves and the skin of the potato, when it's exposed to sunlight, the skin, are toxic, which is why when you go to certain food stores, potatoes are not out in the open. They're covered up underneath a burlap sack or a cover of some sort, because sunlight actually increases solanine, which can cause, in human beings, coma, and that can lead to even death if eaten in large amounts. In small amounts, it's going to cause vomiting, diarrhea, abdominal pain, etc. Anyway, potatoes are the world's 4th largest food crop, after wheat and rice and maize, which are ahead of this. They are an integral part of dietary kilocalories for many peoples around the world. We don't produce as much potatoes as we do wheat, for example, but about half of that. A few years ago, 2014, world production was at about 400 million tons, and most of that is for human consumption, unlike maize. What that breaks down to, the average person ingests about 75 pounds of potatoes yearly. Now, you might be thinking, wow, that's a lot, but it's not me, because I don't eat potatoes, or whatever. But there are large parts of the world where potatoes are the staple, or one of the 2 or 3 primary staples. Areas such as China, India, many countries in Europe, and right here in the United States. So where does the potato come from? The potato was first domesticated in South America, and specifically in Peru at around 8,000 years ago. And that's based on genetic evidence. The archaeological evidence only goes back to about 3,000. But these domesticates come from a variety of native plants in the Americas. And in South America, you still have hundreds of varieties of domesticated potatoes. And we've lost that variety when you go to the shop to buy potatoes. When you think of something like the Great Irish Famine, that was a direct result of potato genetic diversity. The potatoes that were brought back by the Spanish only represented a few varieties, and therefore there was only a very small amount of genetic diversity within each of those varieties, which is why when you had a fungus in the Irish famine that affected the plant, the potato plant, it easily spread between crops and decimated the crops. Anyway, the nutritional value for 100 grams of potatoes, these are not very high in kilocalories, and they're not very energy dense, so only 77 kilocalories per 100 grams, and from that the potato is only about 17% carbs, less than 1% fats, and only 2% protein. Most of the weight of a potato is water, nearly 80% water. Wheat. Wheat is the third most produced cereal grain worldwide, with only rice and maize that are produced in higher amounts. Looking at stats from 2014, this places our annual production worldwide at around 730 million metric tons. That is a huge amount. When was this first domesticated? Looking at the archaeological evidence first, the first evidence that we find for wheat cultivation is around 9,500 years ago in the Fertile Crescent. And wheat is full of energy and nutrients. Per 100 grams, we get 327 kilocalories, most of that being carbohydrates, over 70%, but a fair amount of protein at around 13%, and a small amount of fats at around 1 to 2%. Next is rice. We produce over 740 million metric tons of rice, and rice is the second most produced cereal crop, second only to maize in grain production. Interestingly, a lot of the maize that we grow goes to feed our livestock, so in terms of human consumption, rice is the most consumed cereal grain, even though we produce a lot more maize. Anyway, there are large parts of the world, including right here, populations that use rice as a staple in daily meals. So where was rice originally domesticated? Looking at molecular genetics in combination with archaeological evidence, this puts the origin of domestication in China, and specifically in the Pearl River Valley region, sometime between 8 and as far back as 13,500 years ago. The latter part of that range is based on genetics. Looking at the archaeological record, we find the first hint of domestication at around maybe 10 to 12. But it's not domestic rice, it's wild rice, which appears to be collected and perhaps harvested. Anyway, that's not important. Let's look at the 100 grams value. 100 grams of rice. Rice is less energy and nutrient dense compared to wheat. 100 grams equals only 130 kilocalories. Most of that is carbs, like with all of these grains, about 80%, and a little bit of protein, weighing in at about 7%, with only 1 to 2% fats. And last, for the primary crop staples, and I'll look at a few more very briefly, but the last one is maize, which you knew was coming. Maize is commonly known here as corn. The proper term, however, is maize, which is what everyone has called this crop for centuries, and what most of the world outside of the U.S. Still refers to it as. The word maize coming from the native word for corn, or for that food, in the Caribbean islands where Christopher Columbus landed. And they took the native name and the food, which was unknown outside of the New World, and they introduced that to the Old World. Maize, in that native language, basically means, or translates to, the source of life. I mean, that's how important this food was to native peoples living in the Americas at the time, and how important it is to peoples living today. It was a dietary staple for many groups, and it remains a dietary staple for many people around the world. Maize is the most produced cereal grain crop worldwide, with over 1,100 million tons produced in 2014. That's huge. Remember when we talked about millet at 65? Barley at 145, potatoes at 400, wheat at 730, rice at 740. Amazing. The origins of maize are also really interesting. Looking at the archaeological evidence, we have a form of maize that we find in Mexico at around 9,000 years ago. Now, the genetic evidence suggests domestication probably started around 12,000 years ago. So the origin is in Mexico. And maize comes from a sort of wheat-like looking grass called teosinte, which doesn't look like modern maize at all, and you can see that on these images here. I've got a number of stories I'd like to share with you about maize, but I'm going to hold back. If you're really interested in maize, come and talk with me and we can talk about maize. Maize is one of the poorest sources of nutrition from these 6 primary crops. For every 100 grams, maize kernels give you only 86 kilocalories. Of that, it's about 74% carbs, 5% fats, and 9.5% protein. I want to mention just 2 more crop staples, but these are not commercial crops. They are used and grown widely, and they form dietary staples in populations around the world. And they're important to know. And the first is taro, which refers to a collection of plants in the Araceae family. They tend to be eaten for their large, thick, underground stems, or for their above-ground leafy stems. And we find this as a dietary staple in parts of Asia, Oceania, Africa, Europe, the Americas, the U.S., native Hawaiian cuisine, for example. 2 things that are really unique about taro. First, they are toxic, and you have to boil them or soak them in order to leach out the toxins. And second is they tend to store an excess of calcium, and when you do that, or when this plant does that, it stores it as calcium carbonate in the form of basically a needle. So these microscopic sharp needles, which is why some people cough or have other digestive problems when they eat taro. Anyway, 100 grams equals about 142 kilocalories, of which 34% of that is carbohydrates, but a very low amount of protein and fat, only 0.5% protein, and 0.1% fat. However, very high amounts of vitamins and minerals, especially B vitamins and vitamin C. And last, manioc or cassava, which we're going to be looking at in a few of our readings. Cassava is from South America, and it's used around the world for the starchy tuberous root. And you probably have eaten manioc or cassava before without knowing it. It is in one of our foods. If you've ever eaten a pudding called tapioca, that is cassava. For the tropics, it is the third most important carbohydrate crop after rice and maize, with about 300 million tons produced, mostly in Africa, Asia, and South America. And it's found in all kinds of food dishes, including drinks like alcoholic beverages. Anyway, 100 grams equals 160 kilocalories. Like with taro, mostly carbs, 38%, and a very reduced percentage of fat, only 0.3%, and protein, only 1.5%, but similarly high amounts of vitamins and minerals, especially calcium and vitamin C. Like with taro, manioc is also incredibly toxic and has to be processed very carefully and properly. It even contains cyanide. Yes, the cyanide that you're thinking of, that cyanide. It contains cyanide, which we'll look at in a few weeks. To touch on our readings a bit, and I don't want to focus on this too much because I want to challenge you to read those articles, those chapters, and to really put the meat on the bones. So why change to agriculture? And our readings talk about population growth. It looks at aspects of climate change and aspects of social demand or social change. In other words, that you have a more complex society that is emerging. And that's probably related to climate change, and it's probably related to population growth. But those more complex societies began to take what was knowledge about growing plants and breeding animals, which we probably had for a very long time before we started domestication. I mean, domestication of the dog, for example, probably goes back to more than 30,000 years ago. But you get these small changes that add up, and it reaches a crescendo, with climate changing, with the population growing, and we begin to manipulate those trends, which we may have accidentally discovered or observed for centuries prior to that. Manipulating crops with a specific intent, social change, to grow enough food to meet social demands. And as you read, there are some pretty nasty consequences to our health and our nutrition that came with agriculture. Now, we used to think agriculture was this great invention that led to ultimately improved health and nutrition, including increasing the lifespan, and certainly it came with an increase in the reliability of food and a simplicity of acquiring food, or another way of saying that is a decline in workload. But, as you read, there is actually more evidence that it has come with the exact opposite of each of those misconceptions. And think about that. I mean, some of us probably have those misconceptions as well when we think about agriculture or our own past, that once we have these cities and once we have agriculture and domestication, that we had it made, that life before that was full of incessant work, which we talked about in the previous lecture. But now it's full of abundant leisure, that life before was full of deprivation, but now it's full of plenty, right? We went from sickness to health, from a hard life, a short life, to an easy, long life, from a poor life to a rich life. No more searching for scraps of food. Now we have the security of permanent settlements in food and agriculture. But that paradigm began to crumble 40, 50 years ago. I will not spend a lot of time going over all of these consequences of agriculture. Most of this comes from your readings anyway, so you should be able to take a lot of these slides and add to it, explain it, or be able to explain it based off of what you gather from the readings. Effects to our dental health. For example, there is suddenly a significant increase in the percentage of dental caries and antemortem tooth loss, or in other words, tooth loss that happens before the individual dies. And that's a direct result of eating these starchy, carbohydrate, which is to say sugar-rich foods. Nutritional quality actually declines. It doesn't increase because we tend to grow 1 or 2 or 3 crops. We lack all that diversity that you find in the diets of hunter-gatherers. And that leads to some pretty nasty health effects. Suddenly you have a high increase of protein deficiencies, or deficiencies in a particular amino acid, iron deficiencies, micronutrient deficiencies. And once you're talking about deficiency, you're talking about an impact to the body's ability to grow and develop. So growth rate is impacted, stature is impacted, you have increased frequencies of osteoporosis and various forms of anemia, which is just to say a deficiency, right? Even our tooth size is impacted, literally and figuratively, because our food becomes more soft, more processed. We cut away the fat, quite literally. We don't need to chew as much, so the muscles, our masticatory muscles, reduce in size. And if you reduce the size of your masticatory muscles, or the frequency that you use those muscles, then you impact the bone. Our bone responds to our environment. Our bone isn't hard like a table or like your laptop or your computer. Our bone is alive and it responds to how we use it. So if you reduce the use of the muscle, you reduce the size of the bone. And if you reduce the size of your bone, your mandible, for example, your maxilla, your face, you need to reduce the size of your teeth. So our teeth actually shrink in size as well. Once you begin to live in large groups, you increase the frequency of infectious and parasitic diseases. And in fact, workload and activity also increases for a large number of people, not for everybody. There are the haves and have-nots, but workload and activity increase beyond what we find in hunter-gatherer systems. And that means more impacts to the body and to health. So we have an increased frequency of osteoarthritis compared to hunter-gatherers. We also have an increased degree of fractures, which indicates often tension or stress or violence. And of course there is that significant environmental impact that we don't find with hunter-gatherer societies. With all of that, you might be thinking, okay, what are the benefits then? Last but not least, there are a few significant benefits of agriculture, more than I'm going to go over in this slide, but among them, an increased fertility and a slight increase in population growth, because you can simply sustain more people. But an increase in fertility is not just a product of diet. It's a product of sedentary lifeways and living in a community of people that help care for infants and adolescents. You also have a surplus of food, of course, and that allows you to increase the population size or the growth rate. And you also have the ability to store food because grains are easier to store. They are storable foods. They do not rot as quickly as fruit and vegetables, for example. Okay, let's conclude there for this week. Again, just a review and a preview for this week and next week. This week we looked at the biological baseline and agriculture. You have your final project topic and format assignment due. That's just going to be selection of the topic and format that you want to do for your final project. Next week we're going to look at variation in food systems, materialist perspectives. We have our first documentary, which will be based off of the readings and lectures from this week and next week. All right, we'll see you next week.